Welcome back to my series on watercolors. So we have gone through all kinds of color theory and techniques with watercolors, and now we're going to start bringing those into some landscape activities. Every time I show you a different technique and landscape, I'm going to do two versions of it. On this side, I'd like you to follow along with the same colors, but over here we're going to try it in a different color scheme. Number one, to get more practice. Number two, for you to start making your own choices in your artwork. And number three, everything with watercolors takes a lot of time to dry in between the layers. So this gives you a place to work while we wait for this one to dry. So we're less likely to keep jumping back in because we're not being patient. So let's get started. Today's video is going to be a morning sky. We're going to focus on cloud techniques. So let's get started. So first things first, I took some painter's tape and I put it down on my paper. You can just tape this off if you'd like to have some clean edges. I also like to clip my paper so it doesn't warp. It is watercolor paper, but it still warps. And I always have a little color swatch on my side to test out colors before putting it onto my paper. One of my little tricks is using the tape and putting it on my sweater so that I get some of the little fuzzies off my sweater so it doesn't stick too much on my paper and it peels off nicely later. All right, so for some clouds, our wet on wet technique is how we're going to get started, which means I am just going to wet the entire area of the paper and I'm going to dab in colors and let them flow. All right, so I'm going to start with the lighter color here, which is going to be pink. Like I said, we're going to be doing purple, pink, and blue in this cloudscape here. Now, with clouds, when we start to work with clouds, some things to know. With watercolors, we don't use white paint. What we do instead is we avoid the areas. We don't paint the areas that we want to be white. So what we do is we paint around it by creating some gaps. So when we're creating something like clouds, clouds have shadows depending on where the sun is. You will see a shadow usually underneath the cloud. So when I am setting it up, you can see I'm doing this little dabbing technique. When I'm setting up my scene, I am starting from like the bottom of the clouds, letting that flow. That is where the shadow is going to be created, and the top of the clouds is going to have a white area. So you can see sometimes I have to go back and re-wet the paper because it does start to dry. So this is the wet on wet technique, is the best way to get some soft edges, which is exactly what you want when you are doing clouds. You don't want hard outlines of a cloud. It doesn't look as realistic. So you see I'm going in with the darker pink now. While this is still wet, I'm going to try to go in with a little bit of a purple. Sometimes we want the edge to be a little bit more clear, sometimes we want to soften it up. Another thing we can do is if you feel like something's getting a little bit too dark while it's still wet, taking your paper towel and using some dabbing to break up some stuff too and to lift some of the color. It's always good that you look at some reference images as you are creating your clouds or your landscapes. They don't have to be exactly like the reference photo, but a reference photo is always good to start to understand how does nature create patterns and how does nature break patterns? How does light hit a cloud how is a shadow created in this particular sunset? Now I'm going to bring in some blue as a glaze technique. And a glaze technique as a review is when the paint is dry and you bring in hints of the color afterwards, a more transparent layer of color. So I'm going to bring in a little bit of blue. What I really like about this glazing technique is how you could bring some more contrast to your clouds. You can start to actually use the shadows to shape them a little bit more. So I like to designate a darker color for that. So I'm using the blue right now. You can see I really like this dabbing technique. So let's say I have like a area that gets a little bit too dark. I'm gonna do it with this one. So if I have an area that's too dark, I like to take my brush, kind of clean it off, get it with just water, and hold my brush to the side. And you see how this is just a really nice little dabbing technique to start to create that shape a little bit more. With this second cloud set, I wanted to do some larger clouds, and I also wanted to zoom in more, and I wanted to soften my edges a little bit more, so a little bit less of the contrast. I also mixed the colors a little bit to be more of this like purple and a greenish blue. I added a little tints of the greenish into the blue. And with the pink, I just brought a little bit of an orangey color to it as well. So I switched just a little bit in the colors, but for the most part, it was more so the technique in getting closer and softer edges. So let's take a look at that, try it out yourself, maybe do a little bit of tweaking in your technique and your colors as well, and see what happens. So now that we've got two different clouds here, we are going to do two different silhouettes and add them on top. A silhouette is a shape that is created because the sky and the colors and the light are so bright behind it that we don't see any details in that space. What we end up seeing is just the shape within itself filled with black. So for my silhouettes, I am going to do some birds on a power line and then, a birds on a wire over here, and then I'm going to do like a power line over here. I might add some birds too. I haven't figured it out yet. So I'm going to do it with a thin paintbrush and some black paint, and also I'm going to use a thin micron pen as well. So that choice is up to you depending on how much detail you want. I'm going to free draw it by looking at a reference image. You can also use the Lightbox Trace app if you're a little afraid to do it right now, and use that to bring your silhouette to your final layer. So let's get to it.